Hello, my name is Carl. I'm from Denmark, so usually I'm making videos in Danish. I'm making this video in English. The occasion, the primary occasion, is as a friendly gesture to my fellow YouTuber and Beatles fan Studmuffin, who had a video about a CD with some early Beatles material. That part of the Beatles story is a thing I had spent a lot of time studying. And yes, I said, okay, this is the occasion I saw this video and this is a friendly gesture, but of course it's public and anyone can watch, and I hope that this video will find its way to people who are interested in the subject. And I have planned to make a series of videos. So this is just the first episode. I will take things from the start. Well, sort of. You can always go further back, and at some point you will end with Adam and Eve or something like that, or the Big Bang or whatever. I will not go that far back, but probably most Beatles fans have heard about the beginning with the Quarrymen, John Lennon's school band, and have heard something about being a skiffle band. I don't know how much they know about what skiffle actually is. They might know that it has something to do with using a washboard. And I guess most Beatles fans have heard that famous story about John Lennon smashing the washboard into the head of his schoolmate and near friend Pete Shotton. You should think that would be the end of that friendship, but it actually wasn't. They kept being near friends all through the Beatles area. So that's not it. But what about skiffle? Well, I'm very much into skiffle, and I could talk for hours of skiffle, and I have actually done that in some Danish-speaking videos I made some years ago. I think it was 62 episodes or something, where I was talking and talking and talking of everything that has anything to do with skiffle. I won't do that here. I will try. That's not my strong side, but I would try to keep things to the point and just the most important things. This thing called the skiffle craze was a trend, fashion, call it what you want, in the mid to late 50s in England. It was inspired by another wave or trend that happened in jazz called the revival movement. Back in the 40s, well, a bit earlier, to take it from the beginning, in the late 30s came what has been known as swing music. Big orchestras and most of them white musicians, Glenn Miller Orchestra, Artie Shaw, that kind of thing. Benny Goodman, let's not forget about Benny Goodman and and his use of black musicians, that was actually a bit of a revolution at the time, that he was playing with such guys as Lionel Hampton, Charlie Christian, and such guys. And to begin with, there were it was something new happened in jazz, and that was fine. But then came the Second World War. And you know, people with bombs flying around their heads, they liked to calm down a bit and have some sweet music, and that affected the swing music. And from being something vital, it turned more and more into some, excuse my French, sentimental shit. And there were two reactions to that, very opposite. There was one party that sort of saying, we must go back to the roots, back to find the real jazz, the jazz as it was meant to be from the beginning. And they were extreme purists. And they were searching in the area of New Orleans to find old musicians that had been there in the beginning. There was such a guy as Bunk Johnson. He was not a young man anymore. Actually, he hadn't got any teeth, but they collected some money and they gave him a protest, and he could play the trumpet again, and now he should show all those youngsters how to play the real jazz. That was the revival movement. The opposite movement was the modernists saying, we gotta take a step forward. Things have changed, the world have changed, it's another world now. And I mean, at the end of Second World War, you know, all heard about the atom bomb. A very dangerous thing, a kind of destruction no one had seen before. And all that thing about this is something humans have made. You know, in older times you hear religious stories about such a destruction coming from a higher power. But humans making such a destruction. And there was this feeling of everything going faster and faster, the old world being more slow, and suddenly all things going crazy and very wild and very fast and all that. And there also, that was another thing, you know, all the racist stuff, especially in USA, and of course especially in the southern USA. And you know, there was a new generation of black people that they couldn't connect with that, you know, that cotton picker image. Actually, many of them were very well educated. Miles Davis, his father was a dentist. And, you know, such things. So, and, you know, all those guys like Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, and those guys, they were making what has been called bebop. That's the modern thing. Okay. From the revival movement, it got very popular it started in the USA, and I told you about finding Bunk Johnson in New Orleans and all that, but it got very popular in Europe, and it took a kind of special direction in England. There was this guy, Ken Collier, and he actually traveled and visited New Orleans to meet all those real jazz musicians of the old school, and actually got arrested there. So he's got a great deal of street credibility for that. He was a purist, really, as much purist as they get. And he was really into that thing about finding the real jazz and play it like it was meant to be. Like at least as he thought it was meant to be. Of course, the modernist was of an other opinion. He got this idea about when he was playing a concert, and there was this traditional jazz lineup. You got the trumpet, you got the trombone, and you got the clarinet. That was the blowing instruments. But then, in the middle of the concert, having a few songs, putting the blow instruments away and just taking some guitars and playing some old blues songs and saying, okay, now you gotta learn. We must educate you a little bit about the origins of all this. So here are some old blues songs and so that sort of things. And they were drawing, no, that's not the word. They were, well, they were inspired by, I can say, a tradition in jazz that has been called jug music or spasm bands. Jug, yes, a jug for whiskey. And you all had tried to, in a bottle, that sound you can make there. And that was the basic of jug music. That was the kind of the bass, or the bottom in the music, making a bass sound and keeping the rhythm. And there was this tradition about using very primitive instruments, such as washboard. Yes, there. In blues and jazz, some of you may have heard about a guy called Washboard Sam. Well, I guess you can figure out what he was playing, what kind of instrument. And that was sort of the inspiration, playing primitive music on primitive instruments. It started with this idea Ken Collier had about an almost educative intermezzo saying, okay, listen, this was how it went on in the old cotton fields, but it turned into something else. There were some of the guys that played with Ken Collier, but maybe thought he was a little bit too puristic, and maybe they were a bit more open to other kinds of ideas. Were such guys as Chris Barber, Lonnie Donegan, and some few more. And later on, when they break off, Lonnie Donegan was singing and playing banjo in Chris Barber's orchestra, and there was a specific session where they had recorded the songs they should record, but they saying, hey, can we do something else? And the sound engineer thought, and well, he just kept the tape running and went out to lunch and said, well, let them have their fun. Among those songs was an old Leadbelly song. You heard of Judy Ledbetter. An old Leadbelly song called The Rock Island Line. Quite well known, in folk communities. And they were playing a version of that song. And later on, that very informal, what do you call it? Session was released, and that Rock Island Line became a big hit in England. And it was at the same time as rock and roll broke through in USA. When Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel was climbing up the hit list in USA, Lonnie Donegan's Rock Island Line was climbing up the hit list in England. And that was the beginning of the skiffle craze. And what that have meant to a lot of those who became famous in the different groups in the 60s. Well, you can hear them talk about it, and it's almost everybody from that generation that was deeply infected by that. It had an enormous impact. How come? Well, England, still in the 50s, had deep scars after the Second World War. England was poor. There were some few well-to-do families, but in most cases, let's say a child saying to its parents, well, I like to play the clarinet. Well, the parents couldn't just say, okay, we buy a clarinet for you and we find a teacher and pay for some lessons. They couldn't afford that. They could hardly, they could just about get enough to eat. So it wasn't possible. And most music education and school was kind of boring. If some child were interested in music and well, they could say sing in a church choir or something, it wasn't like there was so many possibilities. And most of the music played in English radio at that time was dance band music. Well, and it was very professional, not in the best sense of the word, but being very polished and well, maybe a bit dull, but it was not like saying, oh, okay, I can do that and I want to do that. It was not exactly like that. What really meant a lot about the skiffle craze was that thing that young people suddenly recognized. I can play. I can make music. And I don't have, and it was not about getting some expensive instrument and being so good. They used all this primitive stuff like washboard and DJ bass and an old guitar and that was it. And then they could make music, and it was very simple music, so they could very fast learn to play that kind of thing. And all over England, there were hundreds of skiffle groups. And there were held skiffle contests and all sort of things. Of course, it was relatively few that came to record their music and such things, but there were some. Of course, Lonnie Donegan, he was called the King of Skiffle. Besides him, there were the Chas McDavid Skiffle group, and of some importance for the Beatles story, there was the Vipers, led by Wally Whiton. They were actually recording at Parlophone, and most of their recordings was produced by George Martin. Yes. So there's a kind of hint in the story, and at the same time, when John Lennon had his quarrymen playing a similar kind of music, I guess not quite as good as the Vipers, I guess. Hard to say, but I don't think so. There was the Vipers at Parlophone with George Martin somehow involved, being producer, sound engineer, or something. At least involved. As I said, they mostly used quite inferior instruments, washboard, DJ bass, an old guitar or something. But there was a few things around with a bit more, a piano, a trumpet, and such things. And you must remember, I told you it came out of the jazz revival movement. So actually many of those English jazz bands playing in a traditional style, they all had, or most of them at least, had adopted this thing about the skiffle session as a part of the concert. One of those bands were Humphrey Lyttelton's orchestra. They had a piano player called Johnny Parker. And I guess a lot of people, a lot of Beatles fans may have heard about a famous recording about the Humphrey Lyttelton Orchestra with Johnny Parker's piano on the lead, a track called Bad Penny Blues. That is actually the inspiration for Lady Madonna. And the story goes on. Humphrey Lyttelton's orchestra also was at Parlophone Record. And the original Bad Penny Blues, yes, George Martin was in on it. And when about 10 years later, give or take, the Beatles were making Lady Madonna, Paul McCartney wanted that specific sound on the piano, And George Martin went into EMI's storeroom and found that particular microphone they were using to when they recorded Johnny Parker playing Bad Penny Blues, to get as close to his piano sound as possible. So it really is connected to the Beatles story. Also later on with things that happened there. The word skiffle, there is a uncertainty of where that came from. The most common explanation is that it actually comes back in Harlem in the 20s. If people couldn't pay their rent, they held a so-called rent party, inviting all the neighbors, and all came to join the party and gave a few bucks to be in there. And by that way, they were collecting money to pay the rent. And there were, at these house rent parties, there were the thing called piano contests or cutting contests. Cutting, yes. Really good piano players were playing and sort of had a musical fight against each other and, well, move away, I can do better. And it was really great piano players. It was people like James P. Johnson, Fats Waller, the young Duke Ellington. It was such guys. So I guess there had been some quite good piano playing there. And it is said, I don't know if it's true, but it is said that the word skiffle originally meant something like collecting money, pass the hat, something that was the original meaning. And it's kind of funny, the washboard came to play such a essential role in the skiffle music, that sound, and think about collecting money. It's kind of funny, I think. Well, but the word was used later on. There was a jazz band, a piano-dominated jazz band in the 40s called the Skiffle Boys, and that might have something to do with it. But the main inspiration musically was the jug bands. And some of them were quite funny acts. You got that, help, what do we call that in English? When you are watering your garden, that snake, it's not called that in English, but in Danish, snake, the same word are used for snake, and that thing you got, and it's quite similar to, watering your garden. Whatever ever you call that, putting a mouthpiece for a trumpet into that and making sounds with that, and all kinds sort of things, and some of it very funny stuff. And that was the inspiration, and there were two very important reasons for that. That people were actually quite poor. Most people were actually quite poor in England, so they couldn't buy proper instruments, and that a generation of that the English teenagers suddenly discovered, I can make music, I can play myself. It's not that thing for very pro professional people, and it's not about getting a very expensive instrument and practice for 10 years and playing scales 5 hours a day. I can get an old guitar, I learn 3 or 4 chords, and I can actually play music. It's as simple as that. Wow! And that was the thing. So, as I said before, there were hundreds of skiffle groups all over England. And yes, one of those were the Quarrymen in Liverpool. And I know this video has not been so much about Beatles particularly, but it's a part of the background for the Beatles story that I think is important to know if you really want to understand how it all began. And it began with the skiffle craze. And you know, that's another kind of music than what's later what became too known as the Mercy Beat style. You know, early Beatles and things like Jerry and the Pacemakers, Swinging Blue Jeans, The Searchers, and such things. But you know, some people have studied a lot on, okay, you listen to the first Beatles album originally. I mean, Please Please Me, and you listen to Jerry and the Pacemakers, Swinging Blue Jeans, The Searchers, and all that stuff, and you try to figure out, okay, what was the original Mercy Beat style? I don't think you can find any. There were some similarities in what they were doing, and there were some overlapping of repertoire in many of those bands. But I guess each band has had their own little twist on it, so you really can't find the real Mercy Beat style. And it's kind of similar to that New Orleans thing, because many people have tried. As I told you, the revival movement was very concerned about finding the real jazz and digging back. Well, if you keep on digging back, you end up with march music, because that is actually how it all began. It began with marching bands turning into something else. And it's the same thing here. You can't find like the Mercy Beat style. There are some overall similarities, and you can talk a lot about them. But if you keep digging further and further back, you end up with skiffle and the skiffle craze. The skiffle craze that I told you before started with Lonnie Donegan's version of Rock Island Line becoming a big hit. It was in '56. I told you that. I didn't directly say 56, but I said it was at the same time as in US, Elvis Presley was hitting with Heartbreak Hotel. And I guess it peaked around 57 and a bit into 58, and then we went downhill and other things began to happen. And some of those who got famous as Mercy Beat acts had roots in the revival jazz. swinging blue jeans in their first days, several years before they became famous, had a more jazzy style and were not using electric guitars, but they were playing with a banjo and maybe was there a trumpet or something? I'm not sure. But what I'm trying to say is this is the beginning. And it's some background you need to know to understand all the things that followed. And therefore, please forgive that I haven't talked so much about Beatles particularly in this video, because this is, the background that is kind of need to know. And so I will end my video here and saying, okay, this was kind of the background story. And now we have set the scenes, and we can begin in the next episode looking a bit more to what happened with those Quarrymen guys. That was just one among hundreds of skiffle groups, and not even a very good one. And how did they become the biggest thing that ever happened in pop and rock music? How did that happen? Well, that's what I'm going to talk about in the next episodes. And yes, so I will end here, and I will excuse my bad English. You please bear with me. I'm not that much in practice of speaking in English, and yes, okay. So that's it for now.